So in this lecture video, I'm going to cover all of those aspects from the evaluation criteria. So I'm going to talk about audiences, about ethics and picking a good topic. I'll talk about organizational patterns and about creating an outline. I'll talk a little bit about delivery and about listening to your peer speeches to give good feedback. And I want to make an important note that this lecture is not a replacement or a substitute for the textbook reading. I'm not going to go over everything from the textbook in depth in any way. And I know that there is a lot of assigned reading for this first unit. So I suggest that you read one chapter from the textbook per day until you've covered all of the topics. That should give you plenty of time to finish all of the textbook reading before you create your speech. Likewise, this lecture video is pretty long because I cover so many topics. And so I suggest if you don't have time to sit and watch all of it, watch a portion of it each day and come back to it as often as you need to review these concepts with me. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today are audiences and publics. I hope that this meme appeals to the gamers in our class. So the first thing you should think about when you go to give a speech is your audience. The audience is always the number one most important thing when you are making a speech. They are the reason for you to give a speech. And so there are a lot of things to consider. You can think about who's in your audience, what they want to hear, what they need to hear, and how you can make the best case to them. And so I'm going to talk about some more of these things in greater depth. So because you have so many choices to make, you can connect with your audience in a lot of different ways. But what should guide all of your choice making when it comes to the audience is how effective you can be for your audience and how you can give an ethical speech for your audience. So I'll talk about effectiveness and ethics. One way to start thinking about your audience and how you can make an effective speech is to think about who is in your literal audience. This is sometimes called demographic or literal audience analysis. And there are a lot of different aspects that you can consider. One is the context, sort of the broader social or cultural or political context that you find yourself in. You can think about the demographics of your audience, like age, race, culture, religion, gender identity, etc. You can think about ideology, which is a conceptual way of thinking about how people see the world and see their place in it. You might consider the homogeneity or heterogeneity of your audience. That means how similar or how different are your audience members from each other. So do you have an audience of mostly people who are all alike in a lot of ways, or do you have an audience that is very diverse? You can also think about the occasion or genre for your speech. So this will become very important at the end of the semester when we get into ceremonial speaking. But you can think of every speech setting as having a certain set of sort of rules or expectations governing what your audience is expecting to hear. A more conceptual way to think about your audience can be described by this concept of the rhetorical situation, which is a concept that was invented or written about by an American 20th century rhetorical theorist named Lloyd Bitzer. And Bitzer claimed that every speech comes into being because there is a real situation in the world that calls for it. There is a moment when you know you have to get up and say something, right? And so Bitzer says that these situations are actually occurring in the world. There's just a situation that happens that calls for someone to give a speech. And so there are three component parts to the rhetorical situation, according to Lloyd Bitzer. The first part is the exigence, or the problem that you're addressing. There's some reason that you're speaking. And then you have your audience, which is composed of anyone who has the ability to modify that exigence. So this is an audience that is willing and able to hear your message and can then act upon it in some way. And then there are always constraints. So constraints are anything that might prevent your audience from accepting your message. And these can be psychological constraints, like if they have very different beliefs from you, or don't like you as a person, or even if their mind is just preoccupied. And they can also be physical constraints. For instance, if they are so far back in a crowd they can't hear you, that would be a constraint. So the rhetorical situation gives us another way of thinking about how can I be effective for my audience by considering the exigence or the problem that you're addressing, why your audience is listening to you, and also those constraints that might be getting in the way of the audience accepting your message. Another conceptual way of thinking about your audience is called the second persona. So this is another rhetorical theory concept that comes from an American rhetorical scholar named Edwin Black. And Ed Black says that within any given speech, there is an implied audience. He calls this the implied auditor, like audio, like hearing, the implied hearer. And that the implied audience, or the second persona, the you of the speech, is created through the choices of the speaker. So the way that we go about putting together our speech is, whether we mean to or not, tailored towards a certain audience. And so if you've ever heard a speech or seen a commercial or an advertisement or something, and you just felt like, this did not speak to me at all, this didn't reach me, this isn't for me, that's probably because you are not the intended audience of that speech. And there are things within that speech or within that ad or within that type of media that signal that to you, right? The type of language that's used, the way that the audience is explicitly addressed, even the subject matter, right? We know if something is sort of for us or not. And that's because within a speech itself, there are aspects of an implied audience. And so we can think about that as you create your own speech. What are the choices that you're making that will let a listener know that you are actually speaking to them? Like, how can you tell someone who you've never met before that this speech is for them? And by thinking about the audience in this more conceptual way, what we're trying to do is address broader publics. So what is a public? Well, when we think about audiences, we have this sort of classic demographic approach, right? But we also have a concept in rhetoric called a public. And one definition of a public, there are many, is that a public is a commonality among people that is based on consumption of common texts. So a public is different from being in a club, for example, but it is similar to being in a fandom, maybe. And so by having something in common with people, by participating in shared texts, you are acting as a member of a public that has some sort of a common concern. And so you can access broader publics bigger than just the class in front of you that is your audience, by using the as test. So when we use the as test, we are addressing a rhetorical audience by the social roles that they are performing. So you can address your audience as citizens of a country, as residents of a state. You can address your audience as taxpayers, as students, as UNC fans. So when you think about all these different ways that you can conceptualize your audience, it gives you new ways to be effective with your audience, and it gives you new threads to weave through your speech so that you are speaking to that implied audience, right? You could speak on the same topic to all of these different rhetorical audiences, and that audience that you're aiming for is going to affect the choices that you make in your speech, right? So by thinking very intentionally and explicitly right up front about who is my real audience, but also who is the audience that I want to reach, my ideal audience, you can make choices that will make your speech more or less effective. So this concept of a public, of a group that shares some sort of a commonality, carries through to the way we can think about ethics in giving speech. So there are sort of two ways that you can think about how you're addressing your audience, and the ethical implications for those different ways. So the first way is the marketing approach. In a marketing approach to public speaking, you as the speaker stand outside of the public and then the specific audience that you're addressing. And this is a less ethical way to approach public speaking because you've got no skin in the game, right? And so, what we want to aim for in being as ethical as possible as public speakers is to imagine ourselves as members of a shared public with our audience. And this is going to help us make more ethical choices in speech making because now we've got skin in the game. We're a part of the same public. Therefore, we have some sort of shared concerns or cares. And we are going to be ethical in our choices because the outcome of the speech affects us as much as it affects our audience. So what the ethical considerations really boil down to is this. If you are perfectly persuasive and the audience does everything that you tell them, have you made your world a better place? Because when you're giving a public speech, you are really calling into being a world, a whole world and a place for us in it. And so have you made a better world for your audience? And did you get there in an ethical way as well? So this idea of being ethical towards their audience informs the way that we choose speech topics. So you should absolutely pick a topic that interests you, but you should also make sure that your topic is relevant to your audience in some way. Your topic should be able to be supported by research, and it should be able to move the audience's opinion in some way. And so keeping that in mind, well, this didn't go in the order I thought it would. My pro tip for topic selection is to pick a topic that you are moderately interested in. So if you choose a topic that you have no interest in because you just picked a topic off a list, you probably aren't going to have any skin in the game, right? You're not going to be able to take that engagement approach. And you might not be able to make the topic interesting for your audience. On the other hand, if you choose a topic that you know absolutely everything about and it's your thing and you can write, a dissertation about this topic, you're going to have a really hard time keeping your audience's interest in mind. And you're going to have a really hard time narrowing down your topic to the key points that are going to be helpful or useful for your audience. And this is a downfall I see all the time, every single semester. I know it's really exciting to speak about topics that you might be an expert on or that you really love or care about. But please heed my warning that if you are the world expert in a topic, you might not want to choose that topic for your speech for this class, or you might need to work with me very closely to make sure that you are keeping your audience in mind first. Okay, let's back up to where I was. Selecting a topic. So in this class, you have the freedom to choose whatever topic you want, so long as it meets these topic criteria that we're talking about in this lecture. In the real world, you would probably have more constraints when you're giving a speech. And those constraints can actually be quite helpful because starting from a place where you can choose any topic you want can sometimes be really challenging. So I would say if you don't immediately have topics in mind, start by brainstorming, do an inventory of your interests, think about the things that you care about, the things that you do in your real life, think about maybe instances where you would need to give speeches or presentations in your career and how you can use this class as an opportunity to practice, and narrow it down from there. In the assignment instructions document, I did put a list of topic ideas for the informative speech. And that's really meant to give you some inspiration for sort of the variety of things you might choose from. You're also welcome to pick off that list, but I think that you will give a better speech if you pick a topic that is of interest to you. So, good topics. These are the criteria. There are no taboo topics so long as you meet the criteria, which include that your topic should be interesting to you and your audience. A good topic needs to be a little bit controversial, and that just means that there is more than one credible side to your topic, right? If you're giving a speech on something everyone already knows or everyone already agrees with, there's no point for your speech, right? Your topic should be researchable, and there should be expert opinions that you can bring in on your topic one way or the other. If you don't need to do any research to give your speech, it's not a very good topic. And your topic should be able to be framed in a way that your audience can hear it, like it can be acceptable to them. It's not immediately so turn off or inflammatory. And that your audience can take some action once we get to the persuasive side. That's more important, but that even if you're giving your audience new information, that it's going to be in some way useful or helpful for them, even if it's just giving them a new perspective on something they hadn't thought about before. So when you are coming up with a topic for your speech, a topic is something that is usually quite broad, and it's possible most of the time to give either an informative or a persuasive speech on any given topic. And it's extremely important for the purposes of this class that in the informative speech, you are giving an informative speech, that you are not moving into persuasion. And this is all about your claim that you're trying to advance and the way that you frame your topic. So, an informative speech topic is usually going to advance a claim of fact, which you can read about in your textbook reading, and it's going to be generally non-controversial. For example, and I'll use this example again later on, if you wanted to talk about the COVID vaccine, you could give an informative speech about how the vaccine works in the body, just explaining or demonstrating the science behind it, right? In a persuasive speech, you are usually advancing a claim of policy, and that's a claim that says how we should do something or what we should do or that we should do something or not do something, right? It's about an action. Or a claim of value, which is about whether something is good or bad, preferable, not preferable. Sometimes persuasive speeches are based on claims of fact, but that's usually when the facts are controversial. Arguments around definitions of things tend to be persuasive claims of fact. For instance, when a speaker argues that abortion is murder, right? This is a common argument that we hear in our public discourse, and it's all based around the definition of murder, that the definition is or is not this or that, right? That's a claim of fact, but it's controversial and therefore persuasive. So if you wanted to give a persuasive speech on the COVID vaccine, you might say everyone should get the COVID vaccine. And that's a claim of policy. You're trying to advocate that people do a certain action. So please keep this in mind as you're picking your topic and also as you are moving forward on your speech, that for your first speech, we are staying strictly in the realm of informative speaking. You are teaching us something new that we don't know. You're helping us see a different perspective that we haven't seen before. You're showing us how to do something, but staying squarely in informative territory. So let's look at some topics that are not great according to the criteria for good topics, and then how we might improve them to make them more relevant to our audience. So first bad topic, beige. It's the new magenta. This is not a topic that is likely to be interesting to your audience. If we were in a classroom at UNC, which is where this example comes from, the topic UNC rules and duped rules would not be a very good topic in a classroom at UNC because probably everybody already agrees with you, right? And so if everybody already agrees with you, there's no point in giving the speech. I love penguins. Well, just talking about how much you love penguins is not going to require you to do any research. And also, it is not relatable to your audience necessarily. So let's think about this. Let's say that these are the sort of topic ideas that you want to talk about for one reason or another. There's always a way to turn a bad topic into a good topic, usually by making it more relevant to your audience. And if you have a topic idea that you want to speak about, but you don't think it's necessarily a good topic yet for your speech, let's work together and I can help you turn it into a good topic. So, beige, it's the new magenta. Not interesting to everybody. Something that might be interesting both to the speaker of this bad topic and to an audience is about how painting buildings in neutral colors is good for energy efficiency. If you love beige, maybe we can find a way to make beige interesting or relevant to more people, right? If you want to tell everybody how much UNC rules and Duke drools, maybe you could focus on why we should create incentives for people to go to public universities. So instead of just inciting outrage or getting people revved up at a pep rally, now you're coming in with something that you can research and share with your audience to teach them something about public universities versus private universities more broadly that they might not have known before. Instead of I love penguins, well, if you love penguins, you could talk about why we should take a more aggressive stance on protecting marine life, right? Save the penguins. These are adjusted topics that take into account an audience a little bit better, that bring in the possibility for research and for people to change their opinions about things. So, speaking of research, you should become an expert on whatever it is that you speak about in your speech. We don't have the benefit of a live classroom for this online class, but if we did, you would need to expect that people might ask you questions after your speech, and you should be able to answer those questions. So when you're doing research for your speech, you should start by outlining what you do already know and look for themes, because that might help you organize your information. And then designing a research strategy can be helpful as opposed to just jumping on Google and starting to search blindly. If you take into consideration that there's more than one place you can do research, there's not just Google, but there's also the library's website. You can think about what you might expect to find. For instance, if you want to talk about marine life and climate change, you might think, well, I should probably look for statistics to back this up. So maybe statistics is one thing that I'll look for, right? And then be flexible in your search strategy, because you might discover during the research process that you want to take a slightly different approach to your topic. And really, if your topic changes during the research process, or it evolves, or it gets more specific, or you sort of focus on something slightly different, that's probably a sign that you're doing a really good job doing research, right? Because when you come up with a topic, you're using what you know about things to develop that topic. And if you are doing research and learning new things, then your topic is going to evolve and change. So if you're not learning anything new through the research process, then you're probably not doing very effective research, or your topic isn't really amenable to research, which makes it not a great topic, right? And then I recommend that you search methodically. So keep a list of your keywords, cross things off the list once you've searched for them, etc. So try to be as efficient as you can in your research process. When you're giving a speech, you also want to use a variety of sources. So think about the full range of sources that you might find. You can look online for articles, for blogs, for videos. You can look in real print newspapers, journals, books. And then even interviews with people or correspondence with people can be a type of source depending on how you deploy it in your speech. And then for each piece of evidence that you bring in, or for each source that you bring in, think about what purpose it's actually serving in your speech, and if it's good evidence and worth using. You also want to make sure to evaluate your sources for credibility. I added a page to our course website that includes some resources for evaluating source credibility. So there's a short 3-minute video that talks about evaluating sources for credibility. There's a link to the Purdue OWL's MLA citation page, and also a link to a library guide about making verbal citations. So look for those resources on our course website. These are just some guidelines for different types of sources that you might want to use and what you would look for in determining whether a source is credible or not. So it's okay to use a blog in your speech if the blog is informed and trustworthy. So that means you might need to look up who writes the blog, what are their credentials, etc. When you're using news articles, you want to look for newspapers that are nationally recognized for credibility. Keep in mind that journalists are not automatic experts. Even the best journalists, news reporters, they go do research and they bring it together and they present that research. That doesn't make them an expert on the topic that they're talking about, right? So if you're using a news article, you want to make sure that that article seems credible and that the sources that are cited in that article are also credible. Op-eds are sometimes very popular in student speeches because an op-ed is an opinion piece. And when you find an opinion piece, it's possible that you'll find an opinion that matches yours exactly, and you can use it to bolster your own claim. But just remember that op-eds are opinion pieces, and therefore they're inherently biased. Bias is not a bad thing, so long as we acknowledge it and recognize that we need to be fair and balanced in the amount and types of sources that we use. Peer-reviewed research articles from scholarly journals are the gold standard when it comes to credible sources. And, you know, Wikipedia is divisive in academia. You don't want to cite Wikipedia as a source. If Wikipedia is the only place you can find a piece of information that you want to use, that might not be a real, true, credible, factual piece of information. Even Wikipedia should have sources cited. And so if you want to use Wikipedia for a reference, which I mean, I do it too, if I would just want to quickly learn a little bit about a topic, find what sources are being used in that Wikipedia, go to those sources, and if they're credible, you can use those sources. If not, look for another source. And of course, in this class and in every class, you should avoid plagiarism. That means that you need to give credit for every direct quotation, every statistic, and every argument that you borrow from someone else in your speech. And you do that through written citations in your outline, and you will also give verbal citations during the speech. So if you have a statistic, then you need to say out loud where that statistic came from so that we know that you didn't just make it up. And so in order to avoid plagiarism and to make citation easier for yourself, gather citation data as you go, as you save information from the web, from wherever. Gather all of the data that you're going to need for a full MLA citation, which includes the author, the title of the piece, where it was published or what website it was published on, who owns or publishes the website, when you accessed it, and a URL for that information. So make sure that you save all of that as you're doing your research so you don't have to go back and search for it. Okay, so you have selected a topic. You've done all this research and become an expert, and now you're ready to start putting your speech together. So organization in your speech is one of the most powerful things that can help your audience follow along with and understand the argument that you're making. So the basic structure of a speech is similar to the basic structure of an essay, right? You have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. In the introduction, you want to gain attention and interest, gain goodwill from your audience so that they trust you, state clearly the purpose of your speech, and preview the main points of your speech. So let's talk about each of these. Gaining attention and interest. The opener for your speech should be interesting. What I don't want to see is that your speech starts like this. Hello, my name is Eileen Hammond, and today I'm going to be talking about penguins. That's not interesting, right? A more interesting way to open a speech would be to tell a story. Just launch right into the story, or refer to a recent or historical event. Or if you're at a particular type of occasion, refer to the occasion or refer to the classroom. Um, Open with a statistic, open with an analogy, open with a question, open with a joke. Open with a joke if you know that you can deliver a joke. I can't deliver a joke, so I wouldn't try to do that in a speech. If you can, you can. And what you're trying to do by gaining attention in the introduction, right up front in your speech, is to help your audience care about your topic right away, right? That it matters to them, or that they care about it emotionally, or that it is linked to some story or event, or whatever that is relevant to them. So right out of the gate, get your audience with you on board. Then you want to gain goodwill, and demonstrate your credibility on the topic that you're speaking about. So you want to develop common ground between yourself and your audience. And that might look like acknowledging something that you have in common with your audience. You can tell the audience about your expertise with that topic or your connection to that topic, and demonstrate that you're a part of a shared public with your audience. So you want your audience to know that you have skin in the game too. Then you need to state the purpose of your speech, and you do this in your thesis statement. So a thesis is one sentence. And when you deliver it in your speech, you want to deliver it clearly as the thesis of your speech, as what you're trying to advance in your speech. And so you would say out loud something like, I would like to argue that thesis, or I will explain how thesis. And your thesis statement needs to meet the same criteria as your topic, right? So it should have some element of controversy, or show that your topic is researchable, and linked to some sort of evidence that you're going to demonstrate. So you can read more about how to make an effective thesis in your textbook reading for this unit. Then you want to preview the main points of your speech. And this is a really important step that you shouldn't rush through. So as you're wrapping up your introduction, it's good to tell your audience the main points that you're going to cover very explicitly, because that allows them to follow along and to track with where you're going. In the body of the speech, you'll have 3 or 4 main points. This will differ depending on your organizational pattern and the amount of things that you want to talk about. One thing to consider with your main points is that you want them to be fairly balanced. So if, as you're outlining your speech, you realize that your first main point has a tiny amount of information, your second main point has a tiny amount of information, and your third main point has 4 times that amount of information, your speech probably isn't very balanced. You might want to rethink the organizational structure of your speech. And we will talk about organizational patterns in just a little bit. You want the main points of your speech to be connected in a logical way, and you can do that through signposting. A signpost, just like a traffic signpost, tells you where you are in the speech. And so that can be as simple as saying first, and then going on with your first point. And then a couple of minutes later, you say, and second. And by using that sort of language that reappears throughout the speech, you're helping your audience to keep track of where you are in the speech at any given time. And you don't have to say first, second, third, but that's the easiest example of a signpost. You can find more examples in your reading. It's also very effective to use explicit transition statements that help to tie together where you just came from with where you're going. So for example, a transition statement about getting a motorcycle might say, but fuel efficiency is not the only reason to ride a motorcycle. You can also smell the freedom, right? So if this is a transition statement, what was the point before and what was the point after? The point before would have been about fuel efficiency, and the point that we're about to cover is about freedom, right? Being on the road, something like that. And then in the conclusion of your speech, You want to prepare your audience for the speech ending. And so you're creating some sense of closure, which is a very important step, because if you don't have a sufficient conclusion, or if you rush through your conclusion, you're going to end up at this awkward point where you just stop talking and your audience doesn't realize that you're finished, right? So you want to prepare your audience for the end of the speech. You do this by restating your thesis, summarizing what you've talked about, and ending with a clincher. My recommendation is to always end the way you began, because it gives that really nice sense of closure. So if you started with a quote, end with a quote. If you started with a story, end with a story. If you started with a question, end with a question or the answer to that question, and so on and so forth. The conclusion is also a great place to think about your pacing. If you couldn't tell yet, I'm a pretty fast talker. And so when I get to the conclusion of a speech or a presentation, I try to intentionally put a nice big pause right before my conclusion and then slow myself down through the conclusion, so that I sort of ramp down the energy of the speech and help the audience understand that I'm coming to a close. So that's the overall structure, right? Within the body of the speech, your main points should be organized in a way that makes sense. And there are a lot of organizational patterns that you can choose from. The difference between any organizational pattern and the next is the way the main points of the speech connect to the thesis, or connect to the topic, or support the thesis or topic. So some possible organizational patterns include chronological, spatial, cause and effect, problem solution, topical, or some combination of these speeches. And so I'm going to give some examples of each of these that I've listed here, and you'll find more examples in your textbook to help you sort of understand how these organizational patterns work. So if I wanted to give my vaccine speech and use a chronological organizational pattern, I'm going to show points in time or steps in a process. So I would say first, you get inoculated. Second, your body produces antibodies. Third, you're protected from infection. So I'm telling you the timeline of events, and that's a chronological organizational pattern. I could also use a spatial organizational pattern. So if I wanted to give an informative speech about how a vaccine works, where it goes in the cells of the body, I might, talk about the different parts of a cell and what goes where. So I could talk about our DNA, which is in the nucleus of the cell, and then mRNA, which is used in the vaccines, which is located in the cell cytoplasm, and then about the antibody protein that lives on the surface of the cell. And so by doing this, I can explain that an mRNA vaccine doesn't touch DNA, can't affect our genetic material, right? Because they live in different places. If I wanted to talk about how a vaccine produces herd immunity, I might use a cause and effect pattern. So if 70% of the US population gets the vaccine, the rate of transmission will decline, and then people who are unable to be vaccinated are protected by the herd immunity of the population around them. So the effect is herd immunity, and the cause is widespread vaccination. If I wanted to talk about how the vaccine will be transported, because it has to be kept really cold during transport, I might use a problem solution pattern. So in this organizational pattern, maybe I only have two main points to my speech, but they're pretty beefy, right? Because the first main point is the problem that the vaccine has to be kept really cold. And then my second main point is about how we need to establish reliable cold chain networks to solve the problem of distribution. In a topical, there are different options in a topical organizational pattern. A topical organizational pattern might talk about different types of something or parts of a whole. You can read more about this in your textbook, but for this example, I used types of the thing. That's a sort of topical organizational pattern. So I might talk about the different types of COVID vaccines, and then my main points would be the 3 different types of COVID vaccine. So if you choose your organizational pattern wisely, it will do a lot of the work for you. And so I suggest that as you are creating your speech that you are really intentional about picking an organizational pattern on purpose. I find that if you don't pick a pattern on purpose, you're probably going to fall somewhere into the topical realm of organization. And topical organization patterns are fine and they're great, but they're a little bit more challenging because it falls on you, the speaker, to define the relationship between your thesis and the main points of your speech. Whereas in these other patterns, that relationship is already established. So do consider choosing an organizational pattern on purpose and letting that pattern help you organize your information rather than having to do it all yourself. Okay, so you have an organizational pattern, you have all this information, all the research that you've done. How do you know what goes first, what goes second, what goes third if your organizational pattern doesn't dictate that? Well, you want to put your best foot forward. And there are different ways that you can do that. The primacy recency effect is a phenomenon that tells us that the things that we remember the most are the first thing we hear and the last thing we hear. Primacy being first and recency being like the most recent or last thing we heard. So if you have particularly strong evidence that you want to make sure your audience remembers, you want to use that first or you want to use that last. And that can either be, making something your main point or your third point, or it can be within a given point, the first thing you say or the last thing you say. You also want to avoid putting a bunch of the same type of evidence together. So if you have expert quotations that you're bringing in, giving 4 quotations in a row is going to take away the power of each of those individual pieces of evidence. So try to vary the types of evidence that you put together. If you're using numbers like statistics, you always want to explain what those statistics mean. Our brains have a really hard time understanding very large numbers and very small numbers. So if you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, I can't really imagine what hundreds of thousands of people looks like just by the number. But if you tell me a football stadium full of people, I would get that. Or if you tell me the population of the entire state of Vermont, right? That makes a number more real and concrete. So try to bring that concrete realness to any numbers that you're using because numbers are abstract. And we want to be as concrete as possible to help the audience connect with the information that we're sharing. And it's possible that you will be giving a speech that has an opposition. This is more relevant for a persuasive speech, but if there's more than one credible side to whatever it is that you're talking about, you might want to address that in your speech, but keep it brief and focus on your own points. So as you have organized your speech, you figured out what goes where, what organizational pattern you're going to use. You will need to create a full sentence written outline of your speech. This outline is different from your speech itself, like the script of your speech, and it's different from a note card or a cue card. And this really shows me the organization and research that you have done to create your speech. It's not going to include every word that you speak in your speech. It doesn't need to include a bunch of narration. It doesn't need to include the sort of verbal citation you might give. So in your outline, you don't need to write according to NASA and then put in a statistic. You can put that statistic and then you're going to give me an in-text written citation in MLA format instead. I have attached a template for an MLA formatted full sentence outline to the assignment portal where you will submit your outline. So if you click into where you would submit your speech outline, you'll find a Word document that I've already set up. I've already formatted it. It's set up with coordinate and subordinate numbering. And so if you want to use that template, you don't have to worry so much about the format of the outline itself. You just need to be very careful about having in-text citations within the outline and making sure that your works cited page is correctly formatted in MLA format. Um, in terms of timelines, you will turn in your written outline 1 week before you turn in your final speech. And that is to give me an opportunity to evaluate your sources, your organization, and all of that, and to give you feedback before you turn in your final speech. So for each of our speeches, you will have to select your topic 1 week, and I'll give you feedback. Then you'll turn in your outline the following week, and I'll give you feedback, and then you'll turn in your final speech. So do be aware that you will not be able to wait until the last minute to do your research to create your outline, right? You need to be working on these things in an incremental fashion in order to meet all of your deadlines. Okay, you picked a topic, you have become an expert, you have organized all of your information, you've created your outline so you know what your speech is. Now you have to deliver it. This is the part that we'll get to it. Okay, so some delivery basics. You want to speak in a way that is appropriate to the occasion. That means there's no hard and fast rule that says to give a successful public speech, your delivery should look exactly like this. Because every situation is different, right? Every rhetorical situation is different. The reason that you get up and speak, that thing that you're addressing, that audience that you're speaking to, the constraints that you're trying to work with, it's going to be different every time. And so the way that you deliver a speech is going to be different depending on your topic, your audience, etc. The goal that you can keep in mind for any speech, though, is to have some sort of balance between formal and informal. So there is a difference between just talking to someone and presenting something, right? So you don't want to be so informal that you seem like you're just having a conversation with someone. There should be, clearer organization than that. There should be, some level of respect and formality in your presentation because you're speaking to an audience. But also you don't want to be so formal that you come across as robotic, right? Because you want your audience to trust you. So how do you get your audience to trust you? How do you project credibility as a speaker? There are a lot of things that you can think about. You can think about the rate of your speech. How fast are you speaking? You can keep it sort of conversational. You can vary your rate going slower or faster depending on what you're talking about. Having decisive movement between phrases. So this includes trying to minimize your vocal fillers, the ums and uhs, but everybody has those, and it's not such a big deal. What you do want to focus on, though, is making it clear that you know where you're going in your speech. And the sort of unfair key to projecting credibility is that you want your speech to seem effortless but deliberate. And that is something that really can only come with time and practice. And I don't expect anyone in this class to walk in the door already being a professional public speaker. And I don't expect that you're going to finish this class being a professional public speaker, because delivery aspects can only be improved with time and experience. And you're going to get to give 4 speeches in this class, which is, in my opinion, probably not enough experience to send you out the door being a professional speaker. And that's okay by me. I want you to learn a lot in this class, but if you still feel nervous giving a speech, or you still have some ums and uhs at the end of all of this, that's fine. And don't be hard on yourself. So you can also think about the tone of your voice, again, sort of being appropriate to your occasion, but not, excessively formal. You can think about how you emphasize certain words by pausing before and after them, by saying them more loudly, or by using inflection of your voice. The inflection of your words is whether they go up or go down. And you can use your inflection intentionally to add emphasis. It's worth noting as well that if you are not paying attention to your inflection, it might be working against you. For example, it is more common among women speakers to use an upward inflection at the end of their sentences. It's called upspeak or uptalk, where you end all of your sentences like this because it's just the natural way that you speak. Maybe it sounds more friendly. Maybe we're socialized into speaking this way because it seems more friendly, as opposed to speaking with a downspeak with a lower inflection by ending our sentences lower, which gives them more seriousness and gravity, right? And this is something that is perceived differently depending on your gender presentation. And so it's just something to be aware of, that in projecting credibility and thinking about how your audience is perceiving you, that you might want to think about the way that you use your inflection. Clarity is also really important when you're giving a speech because you want your audience to be able to understand you. So you might learn a lot about your own enunciation by practicing recording your speech and then listening to yourself, because we don't often hear ourselves the way other people hear us, and recording our speeches gives us the opportunity to do that. And so you might find that you need to practice speaking with more intentional enunciation, or pronouncing your words a little bit more clearly. And that's especially true because we are recording our speeches, and the recorded medium might affect the way that we sound. You also have your body language to work with. So you want to make appropriate eye contact. In the case of recorded speeches, that means look at the camera. You also want to make sure you're not burying yourself in your notes. So if you have note cards, don't hold them in front of your face, and don't look down at them for your entire speech, which should not be a temptation anyway, as you should not have your entire speech written on your note cards. But sometimes it can just be sort of a comfort, a security blanket to look at your notes, and you want to avoid doing that. Try to avoid unnecessary body movements. You might not be aware of any unnecessary body movements that you make until you record yourself and watch it. Some common ones are going back and forth from foot to foot, or using your hands for everything that you say. So you can project confidence instead by keeping mostly still, but then conveying something through your posture and through your gestures. Do we have more about gestures now? So standing really still during a speech can feel very awkward. Just like slowing down your rate of speech can also feel very awkward. A lot of the aspects of delivery that your textbook talks about and that are good things to incorporate into your speech making can feel very awkward and unnatural to you as the speaker. But please believe me when I say it does not look awkward. It does not sound awkward to your audience. The pause that you might need to take to look at your note card, or the keeping your arms at your sides and not moving your hands, or just speaking more slowly, comes across as natural to your audience and can be really effective. This is really especially true actually when it comes to the rate of your speaking, because if you consider how a speech is different from an essay, for example, when you give a speech in a live setting, your audience can't go back and reread what you said. So if you whiz through something, that was the only chance your audience had to catch it, and now it's gone, right? You get that one chance as you say something for your audience to catch it and to remember it. And once you move on, they cannot go back to it. And so making sure that you speak at a pace that gives your audience the opportunity to digest what you're saying is so important. Okay. So speaking a little bit about our note cards. What is a note card? This is a note card. It's an index card. It's a regular standard size index card. It's 3 by 5. You might hear these referred to as cue cards, and that's because what should be on your note cards are cues for you. And what that looks like is going to be different from person to person and speech to speech. You might want to have a cue for what each of your main points is to keep you on track. You might need to actually write out verbatim a quotation or a statistic. And in that case, it's perfectly fine to read off your card. If you want to make sure that you get the words of someone else correct, it will project credibility when you say, according to a NASA scientist, and then you read the quote directly. That shows me that you've done research, you cited that source out loud, you are reading that source to me verbatim, so I know that those are the real words from that NASA scientist. And so it's okay to read off your card for direct quotations and for numbers that you need to remember. Other than that, you should use your cards to help you keep track of where you are in your speech. And so learning what goes on your card is a matter of practicing your speech out loud and using the note cards and refining them as you go. So you might start out by putting all of your main points on your note card. You can use 2 of them for this speech, front and back, right? So maybe you color code it and you say introduction and you have your main points, and then a reminder like slow down. And then on the back, you color code it differently, and this is main point 1, and you put your main points, right? And this should be like a word or 2. The goal of this being that if you lose your place or you forget where you were going, that you can quickly glance down and remember what you were supposed to say next. So while you are not memorizing your speech and every word that you're going to say, you do need to practice your speech enough that you can deliver it extemporaneously, which means for the most part, you remember the points that you want to make, that you can make them, and that if you forget something, you can sort of refer back to your note card to get you back on track again. And so practicing with your note cards and refining your note cards as you go is really the best way to use them effectively. Having too much information on your note card is going to tempt you into reading off of it, and that's going to negatively impact your delivery. So this is the big thing that I think most beginning public speakers are really concerned about. Speaking in front of a crowd or an audience feels scary, right? We're all scared of being judged and of screwing up in front of other people. But here are the tips that I have for you, okay? Everyone is nervous when they give a speech. Even the most seasoned public speakers are nervous when they give a speech. And so if you remember that we're all in the same boat and everyone's nervous, this isn't just you, right? That's at least calming to me a little bit. You can remind yourself that perception and reality are distinct. It would be a different class to argue about that. But what I mean is, you might feel like you are sweating bullets and your face is turning red, or you have that thing where the redness creeps up your neck, right? And you feel it happening, and in your mind's eye, you think you look like a wreck, you think you're stuttering, you think you're talking too slowly, you think you look crazy, like you just don't know what to say next, and like you might pass out, right? The reality of the situation from the perspective of your audience might just be that you look like a normal student giving a speech. Maybe you look a little bit nervous, but they're probably going to be listening to what you're saying and not focusing on how anxious you are, right? So just remember that for as nervous as you might feel, or for as critical as you might be of yourself, and we all are sometimes, your audience is very, very unlikely to be feeling or thinking the same things about you. So you can also try to manage your expectations for your speech. One of the things that can cause some speech anxiety is when we set goals or expectations for ourselves that are way too high. So if you do not have a lot of experience in public speaking, I do not expect you to give a perfect speech, nor should you expect that of yourself. And so if you can set a goal for yourself to do certain things well, to do really good research, to maybe you set one goal for yourself to keep your pace slow, whatever your goals are, make sure that they are reasonable and that you're managing your expectations. Because if you expect to give a perfect speech, you are going to feel like you are failing all the time. I don't expect to give perfect speeches. I don't expect my lectures to go perfectly, right? But what I'm hoping for is that I'm conveying something to you that is useful, and that anything that's not useful is at least not completely distracting you from the useful bits, right? And then after that, some of the biggest, most important things, you have to prepare. You've got to prepare for your speeches way far in advance of the deadline. You have 3 weeks to do your speech. You should be spending that time working on your speech. That doesn't mean 3 weeks to do nothing and then a day to do your speech, right? You need to work on your speech in advance, because the better you get to know your speech inside and out, the better you're going to deliver it and the less nervous you're going to feel, because you're going to be an expert, you're going to be a pro, you're going to know what you're doing, right? And then practice your speech out loud from beginning to end. A mistake I used to make a lot, especially in preparing for classes, was that I would practice one part of something to figure out, what do I want to say in this part? What do I want to say in this part? And then I would just expect everything else to fall into place, and it wouldn't. And so by practicing your whole speech from the very beginning to the very end, you're going to find all of those sticking points that you need to work on. You're going to know right away what your length, looks like in comparison to the requirements. When I gave my first speech in public speaking class in community college, I did not practice my speech from beginning to end. I practiced it section by section. And then I got up in front of the class to give my speech, and I got cut off. I think our limit was maybe 8 minutes, and I had only gotten through 2 of my 3 main points at that point. And my teacher cut me off and said, "Time's up. Go sit down. That's all we get." And I was horrified, because I had done so much research. I had prepared. I had this really intricate PowerPoint, and I had not practiced it from beginning to end. And I didn't realize that I was going on and on and on, and I had so much more information than I needed. I could not fit it into the time frame, and I ended up not being able to even present it all. And that was really disappointing, because I put a lot of work into it. And so you can avoid the mistake that I made by practicing your speech from beginning to end as many times as you need to get it down before you record it to turn in. And then lastly, I would recommend, don't compound mistakes. So if you stutter or you forget something, or you go out of order, you don't need to announce it to the audience. You don't need to say, "Oh, I messed up, hold on," or "Let me start over again," right? If you're giving your speech and you completely break persona to announce to us that you just did something you didn't plan to do, that is going to stand out way more than whatever the error was that you made. So if you just accept that, we all make errors in our speeches, we all have our little disfluencies and whatever that we have during our speeches, you don't need to compound your mistake by stopping and announcing your mistake and getting discouraged, right? Just roll with it. We're all human. So the takeaway for this sermon on delivery is that you've got to define your delivery strategy for yourself. Figure out the things that you want to work on. What do you want to accomplish in your speech? How can you use delivery to help you accomplish that? And then adjust your strategy as you go, as you learn more about yourself, about your own delivery strengths and weaknesses. Okay. So I think this is the last section of this lecture, and it's on skilled listening. It is very important to listen critically as you do your peer feedback, because you need to be able to give your peers the level of feedback that you would want to receive. You need to be able to give them useful feedback, help them to grow as speakers, just as I hope that each of you will do for each other. And if just becoming a better speaker isn't enough motivation, remember that peer feedback is 6% of your course grade in this class, and I do grade it on completion, on thoroughness, on thoughtfulness. So you want to be able to give good peer feedback, and that means listening critically. So what does that mean? Well, you've probably heard a lot about active listening, right? Passive listening is sort of just hearing. You're just letting it wash over you. Maybe you can say like, "Yeah, it was good. I liked it." If you're listening actively, you're paying attention and following along to the organization, to the content, to the argument. And maybe if you've been actively listening, you can repeat back what the speech was about or what the main points were. A step above that is critical listening. And that's where you're not just listening for what is the content, but you're interrogating it as you go. Like, does this make sense? Do these points really fit together that way? Do these really fall into the organizational pattern right? Are all these points really supporting the same thesis? Is it persuasive or not? Does this seem like it was beneficial to me? And so you're being really critical and thinking about, if I had given this speech, what would I have done differently? Did I feel like it was effective for me as an audience member? And how can I help this person make that speech better for me? One way that you can do that is by taking notes as you watch your peers' speeches for peer review. So for each of the speeches in this class, you will peer review 2 of your classmates. You can pick any 2 you want. I would hope that if you go and see that one speech has already been reviewed a bunch of times and there are other speeches that haven't been reviewed at all, you'll pick one of those that hasn't been reviewed yet. And you're going to watch your classmates' speech videos. Now, when you're watching a video, you do have the benefit of being able to go back and listen again. But a more active way to listen to a speech and to evaluate how effective it was is to take notes, just like you would take notes if you were in class. Just like you could take notes on this lecture video. If you're sitting down and watching the whole thing like a real lecture, you would take notes in class, right? Well, this is class. And your classmates' speeches are class. And so when I'm listening to speeches in a live classroom, I take notes similar to what you see on the right side of the screen here. This is how I usually take my notes. And this is based on a type of note taking called the Cornell method, which I have here on the left. So what I do in my note taking is that I start off by noting what the topic and thesis are. I should be able to catch these from the introduction of the speech. And then I try to outline the speech as I go. This is called reverse outlining. If you're listening to a speech and you're trying to figure out what is the outline of the speech as it's happening. And then I'll put a little check mark anywhere I hear an oral citation just to make sure I hear all 3 of them. As I'm taking these notes, I'll make notes on any delivery aspects over here on this side, and I take them in the relative location on the page where they happened. So if in the introduction there's something, I'll write that delivery note up here. If in the second point something's going on with delivery, I'll write that note here so that I know sort of where it happened in the speech. And then at the very end of the speech, I'll think about, what is my overall impression of that speech? What was good about it? How could it have been better? And by taking notes during the speech, that really helps me after the fact to give thorough feedback about all the things that occurred to me as the speech was happening. And I strongly suggest that you also take notes as you're listening to your peers' speeches. You can look at the assignment instructions for the peer feedback that has a list of questions to answer or sort of prompts to help you give good feedback. And if you look at those prompts before you listen to a speech, you'll sort of have an idea of what it is that you're listening for. So I think this is the very end of our lecture video. I have a bonus question for you that you can answer in the 4th week of this unit in topic 4 of our general discussion forum. So our general discussion forum is where you should be posting every week in response to my prompts on topics that are relevant to the unit. So we have a prompt about good speeches and bad speeches, a prompt about active listening. And then in the 4th week of the unit, our prompt basically asks you to summarize something from this lecture video to show me that you watched at least part of it. And then let me know your feedback on the format of a lecture video. Is this helpful? Did it add anything to your textbook reading? And then you get a bonus point if you answer my prompt from the lecture video. So I would like to know, what is the best piece of feedback you've ever gotten on a work that you created? This can be a note that a teacher wrote for you on an essay that you wrote. It can be feedback on a creative project that you created. It can be feedback on something from a parent or a coach, anything that you've created that someone else gave you feedback on. It could be peer feedback that you got. I want to know a time when you got feedback from someone that actually helped you either understand something better about the thing you created, understand something better about yourself, or that helped you to improve that product, that you were able to revise an essay and make it better, that you redid a presentation and make it better, that you adjusted a work of art, or that you improved your singing audition, anything like that. So for your bonus point for the week 4 prompt, tell me about the best piece of advice you ever got on something that you created. So this has been a very long lecture, and if you watched it all in one shot, bravo. We covered all of the things that you will be evaluated on in your informative speech. You will also be evaluated on all of these things in your subsequent speeches, but I wanted to make sure to go over all of it before you had any speeches due. And if you have any questions or concerns about this lecture video, or you need help with anything that you're working on in the class, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email. And good luck in creating your informative speech. I know that they're all going to be really interesting, and I look forward to watching them and to working with you on your speeches.